Great. Well, hi everybody. Welcome to our landscape design workshop, Shape Your Space. My name is Nikki Powell and I work at the City of Oceanside's Water Utilities Department, and I'm going to be your facilitator this morning. So before we get started, I wanted to go over some Zoom etiquette just to ensure everything runs smoothly. Like I've mentioned before, we ask that you keep all of your videos off during the presentation today to limit distractions, and your microphones are also muted. And that's just so that we don't disrupt our speaker as she's presenting and to prevent anything that might impede you or others' ability to hear the information. However, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat box. And there will be a couple 5-minute breaks during the presentation where I will ask the presenter your questions and she will answer them live. If for some reason you are not able to type in your questions, you can also ask questions by raising your hand. And this will only be during the breaks. So you'll click the hand button on the tool box at the right of your screen. And again, this is only during the break, so please wait till then to ask your question, or you can always type it into the chat box at any time. And if you're new to Zoom or you can't find those functions, please reference the participant guide document that was sent out in your registration confirmation, and that will show you how to use those features. And lastly, as a note, this meeting is being recorded. Okay. So thank you everyone who's answered the polling question. It looks like the majority of you have not been to a workshop on landscape design before, so we're really excited to have you. Michelle, if you want to change the slide. Oh, you already did. Thank you. I'll just mention a couple things that the City of Oceanside is working on. So one is an upcoming launch of our Water Smart Meter program, and that will bring automated metering infrastructure to our city. So that's a really exciting project that's coming down the pipeline soon. There are also several local supply projects that we're working on to increase our water supply reliability. So you can visit the city's website or reach out at any time to learn more information about these projects in our department. So now I will introduce your presenter and landscape expert today, Michelle Landis. Michelle is the principal designer and founder of Studio West Landscape Architecture in San Diego. And she has a wealth of knowledge and is involved in all kinds of projects in her role as a landscape architect. So Michelle, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
My pleasure. Again, everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us. As you know, prior to March, these were all held live, so bear with us as we try and figure out the whole webinar Zoom. It's gone pretty smoothly. I think this is the second one that we've run on this format, so we're still in a little bit of a learning curve on all the bells and the whistles. As Nikki said, there'll be a couple points where we'll break, and that way we'll be able to answer your specific questions about the material. So I look forward to hearing from you all, and know that your questions, if you have them, most likely other people have them also. So as Nikki mentioned, I'm a landscape architect by day and have been working in this region for a long time and been fortunate enough to work on a wide variety of projects. And by night, in my spare time, I'm adjunct faculty at Southwestern College in Chula Vista, where I teach the landscape architecture classes. So this program was really an exciting fit for kind of my dual passions there. So I've had the good fortune of working on this project with San Diego County Water Authority since its inception to help create a lot of the curriculum in conjunction with them and their team. So we hope you enjoy it as much as past participants have. So let's see. Let me click. Okay. Use my wheel. So quickly, a word from your sponsor. This program is brought to you by San Diego County Water Authority. So they're our wholesale water agency, and they negotiate the contracts and operate a lot of the infrastructure that provides water to the different member agencies. So City of Oceanside is the host for this particular version, and that's where Nikki works. But there's 24 different member agencies. It serves 3.3 million people in a 920,000 acre service area. They also service 97% of the county's population, and as I mentioned, owns, operates, and builds a lot of our regional water infrastructure. So I think the big lesson for us in Southern California is that our water comes from some very long pipelines, at least the vast majority of it. There's been a big move to diversify our water supply, and you see a lot of the agencies and the water authority implementing things like our desalination plant, pure water supplies, recycled water to help stabilize that water supply in our arid climate. And I know growing up in Southern California, you know, I turned on my faucet and water came out, and I didn't really think about where that water came from. But, you know, you can see the majority of our water actually comes from the Colorado River aqueduct, so 64%, but about 20% is coming up from Central and Northern California. Sorry, my clicking button is not working today. So in 1990, since 1990, which was a major drought in our area, we have had a 30% increase in population, 44% increase in jobs, and a 93% increase in our gross domestic product. And we've actually had a reduction in potable water use of 29%, and that is 47% of gallons per capita. So that is due to all of your efforts at water conservation. So good work on saving water. A lot of those savings come from interior to the house. Those are, you know, efficient shower heads and fittings, plumbing fittings. So now we're really looking at the exterior to see how we can be more water conscious. So a lot of people think that if they want to create a low water use landscape, that they are forced to do something like this. And if you love rock and cactus, then by all means, that's a very low water use landscape. It's kind of a style that you would see in Arizona a lot. However, this example is also a low water use landscape, and we call this our California lifestyle friendly, because in San Diego we have this kind of expectation of, you know, palm trees and tropical effect. So know that you have choices in your landscape of how you want that to look and still be water conserving. So this is our, what we call our case study house, pretty typical suburban residence. You can see that there's turf in front of the house. There's probably not children playing on that turf. Actually, this family has already cut into the turf and created this little courtyard. So probably the only people using that turf would be the maintenance guy who shows up every week or two to mow it, and the neighborhood dogs. So when we look at saving water in the landscape, turf is our natural target because that's what uses the most water. And so if you're not finding that you're using your turf with multiple purposes, it may not make sense for your overall water budget to focus your money there. So this is our case study after installation. And this is where I usually ask my participants, how do you think this looks? And everybody kind of giggles and tells me it looks sparse. And that is correct. You would say this landscape looks sparse. And one of the reasons that's the case is that we also generally want to design for low maintenance, because we live in this incredible environment and we have better things to do than be out in the front maintaining our new landscape. So this kind of water efficient landscape has been designed to fill in nicely at maturity and not overcrowd the plants. So just kind of fill out and continue to be low water and low maintenance. So this is about 6 months after installation. You can see the ground cover is starting to fill out. The little shrubs are starting to get a little bit bigger. And we would say about a year after installation, now we see the smaller shrubs and the ground cover have really filled and knitted together. You can see now that it's really been designed for that maximum plant size. And so you're getting a pretty good sense of establishment. And then here is what we call at establishment or at, I wouldn't say maturity, but at establishment. We consider this to be 2 years after installation. Now you can really see these larger shrubs along the back starting to get some height and soften that wall in front. And you see this kind of turf replacement ground cover. This is called silver carpet, really fill out. It actually can handle some amount of traffic. It functions a lot like a lawn, but without the water use. So again, the name of that is silver carpet. A lot of people really like that as a turf replacement. And just some nice detail of some of the different features. A lot of times these are nice to include in a low water landscape because they give the design a little bit of structure. So boulders can be a pretty inexpensive option, especially if you stick with local boulders. Boulders get expensive related to their transportation. Some pottery, some nice tile, so creating this kind of welcoming atmosphere. All right. Okay. Now why my button's not working today. So this program all started with this homeowner's guide to a water smart landscape. And this is kind of the original document. If you go onto our project website, there's one of the addresses below, and I'll show you a screenshot of that. You can actually download a PDF version of this. And this walks you through the steps of converting turf to a water smart landscape. Once that guide was published, there was a lot of requests from San Diego County Water Authority for people wanting more help. So this 4-class landscape makeover series was created in response to that. And in that class, you go through different topics with a teacher. And then the last evening, it's a 4-class series. So the last evening is one-on-one coaching with a design coach to talk about your property. So you kind of have homework and we teach you how to design, and then the last night you meet with a professional that kind of refines that design. And that was a very successful class, and that triggered a couple of different desire for more learning that was contained in that original guide and has been subsequently expanded. Some of those are on-demand videos. Those are on the program website, designed for the YouTube crowd, where they're nice 5-minute clips. So some great examples, and especially after you go through these workshops where we're throwing a lot of information at you quickly, go ahead and log on and check out some of those videos to really reinforce and see some demonstrations of some of these concepts. There's my button came back. So the original workshop was called our Design for Homeowners workshop. It really focuses on soils and site assessment. We still run this workshop. And now we have these special topic workshops also. So you guys are attending this Design for Homeowners. The focus is on design there. We also have topics on irrigation, installation and maintenance, and plant selection. And you should see those coming up with the City of Oceanside and other agencies. We are scheduling those out right now. So here's one version of the program website. The Water Authority is in the process of redesigning it and pulling it into their master website. So there's actually 2 versions up right now, but this is the original version. Here's where you can access the 4-class series and access the application. That does have some minimum eligibility requirements that include living turf, working in-ground irrigation system, willingness to renovate in 6 months, and willingness to attend all 4 classes. There's been some changes to follow the turf rebate requirements. So I think backyards have just opened up or they're going to be opening up. So if you're interested in that program, feel free to apply. Your application gets reviewed and then we put you on the wait list for future series. We're in the process of finishing out people who were kind of stopped midway in March. So it'll probably be early fall before we get those opened up to people on the wait list again. Here's where the videos on demand are, events and resources. Here's the 3-hour design workshops. You can also download the PDF of the presentation you'll see today on those. So today is about design and shaping your space. It's a 3-hour tour. We're going to talk about setting a water conservation target, reimagining your space, and utilizing plants in your new space. So these are the different steps of helping you create a water smart landscape. And we understand that if we give you some basic knowledge and skills, that helps you to be successful in creating a beautiful water smart landscape. So these are the general reasons we see that people are attending this class. It's to conserve water, maybe capture water in your landscape, reimagine your yard, create a design that works for your lifestyle, and locate some designer resources if you want help. So one of the reasons we target turf is it is our highest water use plant category. So on this map, this is kind of a big fancy word called evapotranspiration, which really translates to plant sweat. So just like us, if plants are located closer to the coast, where it's a little bit cooler and more temperate, they don't sweat as much or utilize water as much, versus plants when they're out in the drier, arid desert areas will use a lot more water. So if you look at a cool season turf located in the coastal strand, it might use 33 inches of water a year, versus a cool season turf that's maybe located in Poway is going to use 55 inches of water a year to keep that healthy and looking good. So when we look at our regional average of turf is using 47 inches of water a year, we have an average rainfall of about 10 inches a year. So that means the remainder of that we are importing from those sources far away, or being produced locally at an expensive cost. And that's why turf is the target. So if we look to an ecosystem where it gets about 40 inches of rainfall, that would be something like Portland, Oregon. And so there you would actually hire people to scrape the moss off of the walls. And you'll notice in that little turf patch in Portland, there's no irrigation heads in that. They get a pretty consistent rainfall to keep that turf alive without adding supplemental water. So turf's kind of an appropriate material plant to use in that region because you're not having to import water to support it. So we live in a Mediterranean climate, which is nice because we get to go outside and enjoy our beautiful weather most of the year. But what that means is we get rain over short periods of time, usually about a 3 to 4 month window, and we have long dry periods throughout each year. And so our plants, in our native plants and plants from other Mediterranean climates, are adapted to that rainfall cycle. So when we look to plants from other Mediterranean regions, those are our most water efficient for our climate. And that's if you trace back to where a lot of the plants that don't use a lot of water are from, they're from these same Mediterranean regions. So we have, if we looked at this gray bell curve, this is really water use of turf. And you can see turf and our traditional horticultural species are looking for the maximum amount of water in July, and that's right when we don't have it in our region. If you look at the water use curve for natives, California natives and Mediterranean plants, you can see that their highest demand of water is right in February, March, and that's when we get our water. So they are they're more in sync with our rainfall, and all of these plants have strategies to survive long periods of low water or no water. And you can see their water use drops way down in the dry season. Now, Sometimes there's more attractive adaptations. A lot of our natives turn into brown, crispy sticks. That's their survival mechanism. But a lot of plants are succulents or have silvery leaves, and so those are also adaptation strategies. So from a regional perspective, targeting turf gives us easy water savings. Landscapes can be easily retrofitted with water efficiency. Some skills and technical knowledge are necessary to do that, and our goal is to educate you to succeed. So with step one of this program, we look at identifying your landscape target. And that is really a factor of irrigation efficiency and plant selection and how much water our particular plants we're selecting use. So when we have high efficiency irrigation and low water use plants, we end up in this 2 to 3 star rating. And hopefully that's why you're here, is to try and get a water efficient landscape. So for irrigation efficiency, a quick overview. Most of you probably have these overhead spray, and these are low efficiency irrigation, and that's because they're high precipitation. And high precipitation is just like it sounds. That's fast rain or a lot of rain coming out, lots of water coming out of these heads. So generally the water is coming out of those heads so fast that the ground can't absorb it and it starts to run off laterally into the street. So these are our conventional overhead spray heads, and these we target to easily retrofit for water efficiency. We have medium efficiency heads. These are our newer style overhead sprays, and they generally have these little rotating stream, looks like little dancing water features when they're on. And these are kind of a slow rain or a low precipitation. So they put a lot less water out, and you have to run them a little bit longer, but the water is actually able to trickle into the ground and get to the roots where the plants can utilize it. Then we also have high efficiency irrigation. That would be bubblers and drip irrigation. And this is an example of inline drip irrigation, which is a really nice low maintenance retrofit. Most of you guys might be familiar with the what we call point source, or these kind of drip tubings. This is also very efficient, but we find over time, if your goal is to reduce maintenance, these can be pretty maintenance intensive because the little joints tend to pop apart, the emitters will pop off, and so you're kind of having to kind of check and repair these a lot. So, inline drip irrigation is more like this. It's a tube, and there's emitters that are molded by the factory every so often in the tubing. And these have little check valves that close, so there's no parts to pop off. And it makes for a little lower maintenance product. This is called a Retro 1800, and it's a nice, easy to use drip conversion. So if this is your pop-up spray in the ground, this just has these guts that you can drop in. You don't even have to remove the sprinkler body as long as it's at least 6 inches deep. And it's got a filter and a pressure reducer on it. And you just would hook up either style of drip to these top T-fittings and run it for your landscape, and very easily create a low water conversion to your irrigation system. Same for a precipitation head conversion. If this is your pop-up head body and this is my high precipitation, low efficiency head, I can simply unscrew it and I can add a new nozzle on it. And voila, I have a nice medium or low precipitation head. And there are rebates just for nozzles. So super easy changes to make your irrigation system that you have in place very much more efficient. I will say, make sure if you're going to convert heads to drip, all the heads need to either be capped or converted to drip. We can't mix spray and drip because they have different run times. Drip is in gallons per hour, so it might run for 40, 45 minutes, This type of medium or low precipitation head might run for 20 minutes. This might be 5 to 8 minutes. So very different scheduling times. And we have a whole section on irrigation. But I know a lot of you haven't attended these. So we also, another factor in our water use is our plant water use. So we have very low, that's a lot of our succulents and California native species. We have low water, which also have a lot of these Mediterranean adaptations. Medium is generally our standard horticultural species that we see around town. Those are still in favor, but I would say a lot of them are falling out of favor. Medium to high water use is the turf and some of those like heavy tropical plants like the cannas and the bamboo and the papyrus. And you're actually seeing those fall out of favor because of the cost of water. So one of our first steps is to create a basic plot plan. And to do that, you're going to measure your property. So here's our case study house again. And you can see there's measurements starting at the curb. There's that turf parkway, 5 feet deep. Sidewalks 4 feet deep. There's 15 feet back to this little landing here, 22 feet along this wall frontage, a 5-foot wide walkway. So you kind of keep track of those measurements. And you can use a piece of grid paper as the base for your plan. So grid paper comes in all kinds of scales. A very common scale that works well for residential, standard residential lot is 1/4 inch scale. So what that means is every grid on that paper is 1/4 inch big. And so that translates to how many feet you just measured. So, if we have something that's here, it's about 4.5 feet wide, or it's 5 feet to the edge of the curb, that's what that might look like. We're just counting back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for that parkway. And so we can translate this very easily and make this what we call our base plan. Always good to indicate the scale on the plan. So in this case, it would be 1/4 inch scale and what direction north is. Another thing that's important in evaluating our site is our soil texture. And this is really going to drive a lot of how fertile our soil is and how well our soil handles water. So you've all been to the beach, and we know that water moves through sandy soil very, very fast. Those are our biggest particulates in soil. It doesn't hold a lot of water, and it also doesn't hold a lot of nutrients. Silt is our medium-sized kind of weathered rock particle, and that it has a medium water holding capacity and a medium nutrient holding capacity. And most of our soil in San Diego falls into that mid-range or I would say sandy loam, sandy silty range. And then last but not least is clay. So we don't have a lot of areas of clay. Generally that's found on the mesa tops, although I know up in North County there are some significant pockets of clay. You generally know if you have clay soil because it becomes really soggy and wet, and it really holds water once it's wet. You can almost take a clod of it and form it into a pot. So you have a lot of these pottery canyons where that's what the Native Americans were doing. So very slow water drainage through the soil holds water very, very tightly once water's in there, so tightly that a lot of times it won't release it to the plants. It also holds a lot of nutrients, but again, doesn't release it well to the plants. So in San Diego, we mostly have this mid-range that is a mixture of particle types, and that's called a loam, when you have a little bit of all of this together. So if you're going to determine your site soil texture, you'll start by digging a hole. You're going to remove actually this mulch or surface matter on top and get down to the mineral component of soil. And we recommend digging a 12 by 12 by 12 inch hole because we can reuse that hole for a percolation test, which we'll talk about in a minute. And you're going to take a sample from the side of the hole and go down at least 6 inches. So think about slicing a layer cake. and that's going to be what you can use to test your soil. And this is for your soil texture. It's not a horticultural test. It's really just trying to understand what percentage of these soil particles, these mineral particles, you have in your soil. So the easiest way to do that is to put your sample of soil in a mason jar and fill it about half full of soil and about half full of water. I'm going to shake this one up pretty well. You can see on the slide, you've got these real nice striations of sand and clay and silt, and it's very easy to tell where one stops and starts. My experience is most of the weathered rock in one area is all the same color, so you don't get this really clear banding. So I like to also kind of time when I start my soil texture sample. So I've got everything mixed up like chocolate milk. And then I'm going to put my jar up. In the first 5 seconds, my sand is going to fall down. And I'm going to mark it where I see it fill up to. And then I'm going to let my jar sit for about maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And I'm going to mark it again. And that's where my silt is going to settle down. And then I'm going to let it sit for 8 hours, a day, a week, however small those little fine clay particles take to settle down, and that will be my clay layer. And then you can go online and Google this USDA soil texture pyramid, and you can see that this is a method to take these percentages and translate it into your soil texture. So if I'm looking at a loamy soil and say I have 40% sand, 40% sand, 40% silt, and I guess it would be 20% clay. We're right in that loam. So you kind of come down each side, 40, 40, and 20. And I end up right in that loamy range. So that would tell you, translate your results in your mason jar test to your USDA soil texture pyramid to find what texture your soil is. Again, this is important to understand how water moves through your soil, and it's going to drive some of your plant choices and how it handles, like whether you can infiltrate on your property or not. So it affects percolation and infiltration. And that's related to soil texture, which is what we just talked about, aggregation, which is what we're going to talk about, and then if there's any layers of compaction or rock. So in some of our region, we have these old marine layers that can really impede water moving through the soil sample. So percolation test, we're going to take that 12 by 12 by 12 inch hole. We're going to fill it with water to saturate the soil, let it drain overnight. Or it might not take overnight. You're going to let it drain all the way, lay a stick over the hole, refill it with water, and wait an hour and measure to see how far the water has dropped. And then if you're around, hopefully you can do this on a Saturday when you're around the house. If you can take a few different measurements on the hour, you can average out how much it's dropping. Sometimes it'll drop a little faster at first and then slow down, and that's going to give you your infiltration rate. So when we see an infiltration of less than 1 inch per hour, we know that's a slow infiltration rate. 1 to 3 inches per hour that's kind of our golden zone. So it's draining fast enough to let water through the soil, but there's enough water being retained around the plant to support healthy plant growth. And if we're draining at more than 3 inches per hour, that's what we call fast drainage. If we have slow drainage, we're going to want to select plants that are tolerant to that condition, and that might include the things that are more kind of traditional horticultural plants, where they have more of a green, lush, tropical effect to it, because they're going to be able to tolerate having water around the roots, versus if you have fast drainage soil, those are a lot of our succulents and our kind of Arizona plants, because they don't like a lot of water. They're adapted to very, very arid climates. So if you have water sitting around their roots, a lot of times they'll get rotted out. So if we want maybe tropical plants and we have very fast draining soil, we might have to import some richer soil with more organic matter to keep the water closer to the plants, and vice versa. If we have slow draining soil, we might have to import some really fast draining soil and mound it up so that the water drains away from the roots of those arid climate succulents. So, happy birthday. We're going to take our first break here so we can open it up for questions, and then I'll explain why you see a happy birthday cake on the page there.
Thanks, Michelle. All right, everybody. It looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, and not everyone has access to the chat function. So I do apologize for that. If you have a question, I'd encourage you to raise your hand. So you can do that by clicking the participant window. There's a blue hand icon, and I will unmute you to ask your question. If you still want to type in your question, you can send them to our email and I can monitor those, and that can be in place of the chat. So the email, if you'd like to type in a question, is valueeveryDrop@oceansideca.org. So again, it's valueeveryDrop@oceansideca.org. So feel free to email those questions. I'll monitor those. And I will also now take a few that have their hand raised. So I'm going to unmute Doreen so that you can ask your question.
Hey, Doreen.
Hi. If you want to do more just a zero water use, can you just not have, do you have to do all this? I mean, if you're going to just do mostly rocks, do you need to do all this and figure this out?
If you're going to put plants in, if you're going to put any kind of plants in, you really need to know how your soil is handling water. And that comes down to, if you're selecting those very, very, cactus, dry, arid climate plants, they can't handle a lot of water at the roots. So if you have a slower draining soil, it's not infiltrating water, you'll spend your money on specimen plants and you'll probably lose them because they usually start to rot out. You see the little black dots starting, and they just slowly fail. So some of those succulents can be very pricey. They're specimens. They take longer to grow. So I would say protect your investment and figure out what your soil texture is. And I know it seems a bit overwhelming. We're throwing a lot of information at you, but again, I would point you back to the videos. That was really an overview of the steps in 30 minutes. So those videos really can help give you some demonstrations to all of these technical skills before we jump into design.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We now have a question from Rana. I will unmute you now.
Hi, I would like to know about landscape fabric that would go under said rocks, or if you're doing a combination of plants and rocks. Some people do plastic. I understand it kills all nutrients in the soil. So if you're doing some plants, where are they going to get anything besides cutting a hole in it? So I don't know if I'm jumping the gun, but
no, that's fine. Because this focuses on design, so that's a great question because it's not really talked about much in this particular special topic. So my rule of thumb is when you use weed fabric or filter fabric, it's kind of like putting a coffee filter under your mulch. If you have inorganic mulch, so rock mulch, a decorative rock that you brought in, that tends to be pretty pricey material. And we want to make sure we keep that rock on top of the soil so when it rains, it doesn't kind of settle into the soil and you lose it. So we do recommend filter fabric between inorganic mulch and the soil. But in areas where you're planning to plant or not have inorganic mulch, we don't recommend a weed barrier. We recommend 3-inch layer of a good quality brushed mulch. And what happens is over time that will break down, but it's also feeding the soil and it's creating an aggregation. So this is an example of, we have a clay loam at Southwestern College in our botanic garden. So this is from an area that was never amended. And you can see these kind of big clods that I crammed in my jar here. And that doesn't do much for plants. The plants just locks up and they can't access water. This is the same site, and you can see how it's got this little fine aggregation. This was simply wood chips. It wasn't even a brushed mulch on top, but it starts to improve the soil and get aggregation and allow roots to penetrate and water to start moving through the system, and also hold water up where the plants can access it, because each of these little aggregates will get a glaze of water on it. So that's what we're aiming for plant success, is really healthy soil. So when you either amend with a compost, like if you're planting a big area, we might rototill or we might add some compost into the backfill to get that aggregation going. Or if it's maybe an area where you have a mature tree, we might use a composted mulch as a topping layer. And that starts to break down and feed the soil and get this aggregation going. And then about every year or two, you'd have to replenish that. I hope. And so we don't want to impede that process by putting a weed fabric. We want that mulch to break down. When I see organic mulch and weed fabric, what happens is you get these kind of pockets of soil and the weeds start to grow on top of the fabric, and then their roots get tangled in, and you go to pull the weed and all the fabric comes up, and it becomes a real maintenance problem.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. We did have one question come in on email that's good to address for the group. So they're asking, I've already pulled out all of my turf in anticipation of doing this. Does that mean I wouldn't qualify for the rebate or similar programs?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is one of the rules from my understanding. Now, it's not my program. You can certainly try to submit. It is the Be Waterwise website, and we'll look at a website for that. But my understanding is you need a notice to proceed. So you have to upload pictures of your turf and pictures of your irrigation system and a basic plan to qualify for that. And then they review it and give you a notice to proceed. So I think because your turf's already gone, it's probably not going to qualify.
Yeah. Okay, and then I have Malind, who I will unmute now to ask a question.
She's muting. Yeah, hi. My sprinkler system is broken right now. So for me to qualify for a turf replacement rebate, do I have to get things fixed and get a lawn going again and then take it out to be able to get it?
So I think there's two things there are two different questions that I heard. One is sprinkler irrigation functionality, and one is getting a turf living again. So the rebate does require living turf. So that's one thing that's needed. I believe it requires a working irrigation system, but Nikki, maybe you can chime in on that. You might know more detail.
Definitely yes to the living turf, but your irrigation, I believe, does not have to be entirely functioning.
Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I would say for our 4-class series, we do require a working irrigation system, and that's because in order to do an easy retrofit irrigation plan to support your new plants, we need that to start from. So that is a requirement for the class, but it sounds like not necessarily for the rebate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, Tanya is up.
Okay. Tanya, you have a question for me?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So I'm logged on a little bit late and I missed the first part. Were there links or videos that you showed in the first part that maybe I missed? And my other question is I've been searching so many, zero water landscape type things. I can't really remember about this rebate water, whatever it is. Where can I find that information?
Yeah, so at the end of the slideshow, I do have a slide specific to the rebate. So you guys, I can point you to the website. That is not anymore run by San Diego County Water Authority. It's run by MWD to the north. It's a different agency, but it is applicable to our region. And then we'll also go through the program website at the end. So it'll give you an idea where those videos, you can find those links to the different videos that really support a lot of this content and add a lot of demos so that you can see these, in person, what people, doing a soil texture test and things like that.
Thank you.
Michelle, I'll just jump in and say, so the rebate program, all the information is on SoCalWatersmart.com. And so that will be the website that Michelle has up on the slide at the end. And we can also email after this and give you the link to that site so you can take a look at the rebate program. Perfect. Okay, we'll do one more question for this break. I'm going to unmute Michael.
Hey, Michael.
He might not be unmuted yet. I think it's being
slow. Yeah, I think so. And sometimes I know on my computer it's F6 is the little speaker toggle. Has a little speaker symbol on and off. So if you're still muted on your computer, that might be a way to let us hear you.
Okay.
There you go. Hear you.
No, I irrigate my lawn using garden hose and rotating sprinklers and stuff. A surface.
Mm-hmm.
Is that considered an irrigation system, or does it have to be underground?
For the rebate program, I'm guessing that is, and hand watering is a very, very efficient way of irrigating. And that's because when they've done studies, people don't tend to keep applying water as water's running down the street. They'll turn the water, they'll stop and go back inside. So it is considered an efficient irrigation system. It sounds like for the rebate, it works, but for the 4-class series, it does not, because we are looking at part of our deliverable for our grant funding to keep it free is producing an irrigation plan. So we kind of need that to start with. It's basically funded by agencies that we track real water savings. And so that's how we keep that program free for participants, is we need to show the water savings. So it doesn't help us support those numbers.
Also, I grow a lot of vegetables. Is that included in this landscaping thing?
So we certainly talk in our plant selection about edible plants. And the way that edible plants are typically used is they do tend to use more water, but you're also producing food. So it's not just a wasted water use. So I think, you're benefiting from that water. You're not just kind of throwing it away. So I think that is it's a different form of sustainability in the landscape.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I did confirm, so to be eligible for the rebate, you just have to have existing turf. So there's no requirement in terms of the irrigation system that's already in place. But again, we will send out a link which has all of the eligibility requirements for that program after this workshop today. So thank you everybody for your questions. And I just wanted to say again, you are welcome to email your questions in. We just sent out an email that you should have received so that it's easy for you to just click on the email if you'd like to chat those in, and we'll have another break and then some time at the end for additional questions. So thank you.
Yeah, and we will be sure to get to all your questions. So don't panic. We're around. We're safe in our homes, you know, waiting for your questions. So just fine. So birthday cake. So, you know, our brains are really wired to solve problems. They're really amazing computers. And so when we start to look at design, our brains really want to jump into the fine detail. And what typically happens is people will go to the nursery and they'll find a really cool plant that's got maybe a really neat flower on it, and they'll buy it for their landscape, and that will really trigger the design. But we're asking you to kind of step back from the detail and think about your yard as a big picture kind of strategy of what's the master plan for your yard? How do you want to use your space? Where are people going to walk? Where are you going to gather? And so when we as professionals tackle design, we do this kind of big overview pass called our kind of conceptual design phase or bubble diagram phase. So we're asking you to kind of step back and think about the big picture, then come down into the fine detail about what plant goes where. And just like baking a cake, you don't start with the icing roses on the cake. You really start with creating a cake batter and mixing it and baking it and, you know, getting the layers out of the pan and then doing your base coat of frosting, and then you get to the pretty flowers, right? So landscape design is the same way as baking a cake. Oh, my little button doesn't want to work again. So we explore landscape design as two parts. The first part is shaping our space and thinking about how you're going to use that space. And so we look at, you know, how our major elements fall within that space. We start thinking about design in the third dimension of walking through that space, of understanding there's this seasonality, that the space changes, whether it's winter or summer. Setting some forms to follow the functionality of the space, and then getting to the aesthetics, which might be the different colors and materials and things we use. And we're going to talk about that a lot in this session. And then we get to planting design. So how the space is filled with plants for effective design. So we'll talk about that a little bit in this special topic, but there is another topic just on plants. So if you feel like you want more, there's other options for you. So think about how you've got this opportunity. You're pulling out turf or have a new landscape space, and we have this amazing climate in Southern California where we can be outside probably 350 days of the year. So think about how you're going to use that space. Are you needing an outdoor room for gathering, like an outdoor living room? Do you just need a better passageway, maybe to your front door? Maybe you have one of those really tiny, narrow, 3-foot wide walkways that the builder has poured, you know, to your door that's not very graceful to access the front of your property. Or maybe you're the type that you've got all kinds of amenities and pool and entertainment and outdoor rooms and back, and you really don't even want to be out, maybe even maintaining your garden. So then we might look at an outdoor garden space, or that a lot of times that works for curb appeal when you're selling a house, right? To these big masses of plantings that can be low maintenance and be colorful and beautiful and just something that you walk through and greets visitors. So think about, is your space an outdoor room, a passageway, a garden, or a combination of those three? So when you think about outdoor rooms, we create walls in rooms just like we would in a house, but outside our walls don't need to be solid to create a sense of enclosure. So here's an example of just a little low seat wall with bougainvillea draping over the end and really defining that perimeter of the room. That could easily be a row of shrubs too, creating that edge. Here's one that's an outdoor room that's kind of nestled within the architecture, creating a nice little outdoor living, dining area. This one happens to have a floor that can handle a lot of traffic, nice stone surface that's kind of grouted and paved. So if you had a party, people could spill out into this area. This one's designed to be used a little less often. So maybe this is where maybe every once in a while in the summer, we have a summer party and we can set tables around it, and we've got landscape joints that keep that more green and more garden-like the rest of the year. Generally in rooms, we have some kind of a ceiling. So that could be a formal structure like a canopy or an arbor, or it could be a tree, you know, providing a nice canopy above us. So you may or may not want to include a ceiling if you decide to add an outdoor room to your landscape. Passageways help provide what's called wayfinding, or that's cues to people visiting on which direction they should move through the landscape. Sometimes opening up that front path is nice for curve appeal. Sometimes there's a little bit of a curve to the path for a little mystery, and maybe there's a little sculpture or art feature along that pathway journey. Of plants and boulders. Here's an example of a project that I worked on in the past where this is also designed to infiltrate water, like a stormwater swale. So they actually have a little dry creek water feature, but this collects water from the driveway, and there's a swale down in here, and there's just kind of more of a California native meadow-like effect in that. But that would be considered a view garden with an overlay of stormwater management. So view gardens are designed to be enjoyed from a distance, treat as kind of a canvas, like an art piece. So we're kind of thinking about how we place the plants and create some color. And usually, sometimes we'll include paths for strolling or just maintenance to access those paths. A view garden can also look beyond the perimeter of the property to borrow scenery off-site. This is a really interesting project that we did up in Point Loma that looks over into the naval base at North Island. And we did a lot of work to kind of make sure that the water matched the water in the bay and create this borrowed scenery. And what that does is it kind of unites those two views and makes your yard seem a lot bigger than it actually is. So if you have a nice mountain range, or maybe a peak view of the ocean or one of our estuaries, think about incorporating that into your design as part of the view. For low impact development, or LID, that's really focusing on how stormwater is handled in our landscape. Again, we have a whole irrigation and stormwater special topic, but we'll touch on some of that briefly. So we look at landscapes as either non-permeable, like concrete, where water does not penetrate through that. Semi-permeable might be, gravel or rock, or soil that hasn't been amended and is very tight and locked up. Or permeable, that's where we have kind of healthy growing soil. And so if we're trying to manage water on our landscape, we might include some permeable surfaces to infiltrate water down and also help our plants have more of a reliable, naturally occurring base to store water temporarily in our planting. So think about, as you're thinking holistically about your yard, some of these permeable and non-permeable spaces. So kind of assessing how you can integrate water use is you can go into Google Earth or one of these aerial satellite imagery and view your house, and you can see how the roof kind of crickets or folds. And you can see, like, this is an area where water, we would anticipate a lot of water, coming off this roof, onto this lower roof, and into this front yard area. There's some amount of water shedding here, so we can start to understand how water moves through our property. And we might know, yeah, we have gutters here, and those go out to the street. So when we start understanding how water moves off our roof, through our landscape, and out to the street, we can decide if we want to integrate a stormwater component into our landscape design and manage water. a lot of you guys were interested in the turf rebate. A component of that is water management. Sometimes that's as simple as a rain barrel being installed at the edge of the roof. You could also choose to implement kind of a depression where water can be captured and infiltrate in your landscape. So understanding what features hold water to infiltrate into the soil, we want to kind of add that to our base plan and understand maybe the movement of water through the area. And so you can see the front half of this is draining. If we wanted to get into like really engineering of knowing exactly how much, you could do calculations based on dividing this up into squares and triangles and figuring out the area of each one. We have a sustainable landscape practices guide on the resources section of our website that gets into a lot of these calculations in great detail. We found that we lost a lot of people in water calculations, but basically you'd calculate the area and then you would, there's this very simple formula that we'd use to translate that into cubic feet. So in this particular place, we had 496 square feet of area that's draining onto our lawn. And then we could calculate that using pretty simple formulas. By 1 inch of rainfall is about average for one of our larger storms, times that area that we calculated, times 0.62. That's going to convert our square feet and inches into gallons. Sorry, gallons divided by 748 is cubic feet. So again, if the calculations are, I know we're glossing over them, there's a whole separate document that walks you through these calculations. So if we're looking at stormwater as an overlay, we also want to be concerned to keep any water at least 5 feet away from foundations, 10 feet away from other buildings, 3 feet from hardscape. If we have those really clayey conditions or poor percolation, we did that percolation test and it's draining slowly, we definitely want to work with a professional so that we don't cause any damage to the structure. And this example was one of my staff people's relatives who was doing a remodel, and the city told them that they needed to disconnect their downspout of their house. This used to go out to the street. And so the contractor followed that direction and he disconnected it and he created this little band of rocks. Well, that was draining too close to the house. So when it rained, all the water drained along here and was pulled up into the house and did about $10,000 worth of damage. So you don't want to be draining water next to your house. You want to get that out into the landscape and sinking down into the soil away from any structures. So we can create a little envelope of where it's safe to infiltrate. We would say 5 feet from any building or property lines, 3 feet from an impenetrable, impermeable surfaces. And usually we don't want it too deep. So, no deeper than about 12 inches below the grade. And that's your safe area to hold water as it's slowly sinking into the soil. So our goal is to slow the water down, store it, spread it, and sink it. Again, this is if you want to manage water. A lot of our small scale residential, the water is designed to be shed and off to the street. So some people don't want to get into integrating it into the landscape. They might simply choose to just put a rain barrel and the corner of around the downspout and have that meet their stormwater minimum to access the rebate. So cross-section of a basin, you can see this is, limiting the depth of it. This is only 4 inches deep, but you can plant right in this. It doesn't have to be filled with rock. Well, you see a lot of people using rock, but you can put plants in it. And this is about 14 feet long, 12 feet wide, 4 inches deep. That's going to hold about 50 cubic feet of water. If you had an existing downspout going out to the street and you wanted to incorporate infiltration, you could break that downspout and have it, drain into this new basin and then use the existing piece of pipe over here that originally went out and create a little overflow. So once water started to fill up in a big storm event, water could just overfill and continue to drain out in the conventional manner. Slopes are trickier to slow down water. You can try and dig some small trenches behind plants to help slow down the water infiltrate. And then here's just a few examples of what these stormwater features look like in a landscape. So this is very common in our region. It's the dry stream bed look. A lot of times I see these in landscapes and they're not functional. So if you have a smaller yard or you like a more contemporary look, you could create this infiltration trench instead of a more meandering organic form. This, in the old days, we would call these a French drain. And the main difference would be a French drain would collect and move water to another spot. And these days we might use a perforated pipe so that water slowly infiltrates out into the area. Cisterns are a bigger form of kind of the rain barrel. This one, you can see this kind of craftsman house, and they've matched the stone to the house, and they're collecting water from the roof. If you have a small yard, you could use what's called a dry well. So that's really just a smaller opening of rock that is goes down deeper and filled with large rocks. So you send water there and it just infiltrates down, but it doesn't have as big of a footprint. Rain barrels are probably the easiest way to manage stormwater and tap into that rebate, but know that rain barrels fill pretty quickly. So if we looked at that 1,000 square foot roof, or if we used an example of a 1,000 square foot roof and a 1-inch rain event, we would end up with 83 cubic feet of water, and that would require 11 55-gallon rain barrels. So these fill pretty quickly. So if you're going to use kind of a rain barrel, or this is like an off-the-shelf cistern, you should always have some way to drain that when it gets filled, overflow back into your drainage system and move it away from the house. So we never want water to be overflowing right next to our structure of our house. All right, so basic area calculations, length times width times depth is our cubic feet. So when you kind of have this integrated into your landscape, you can do a basic calculation and figure out about how much water that could hold. Again, if you want to integrate a stormwater feature in. Again, lots of information in the Sustainable Landscape Practices Guide on our resource page, dialing in depth into those calculations. Okay, break time. So I'm happy to take some other questions. Looks like we're about halfway through the session, so we're doing well time-wise.
All right, we have a couple hands raised. So Michael, I'm going to unmute you or ask you to unmute yourself now.
Hi, if we're unable to finish this session or can't make another one, can we record these? Or are they on your website?
So we're looking at that right now. I know that Nikki is trying to record this one. We tried to record the last one and it wasn't successful. So we're making an attempt, and we just need to reach out to the Water Authority, and you know, it is their program, so we want their input on how readily we can make those available. But again, I would point you to some of the videos. There's some really great demonstrations in the videos that support a lot of these concepts. Those videos have been created based on this curriculum. So I think you'll get a lot of help there.
Great. Okay, Tanya, I'm going to ask you to unmute now.
Hi. So my question, you were talking before about the fabric, and then you were saying not to use the plastic. And I always thought that was to keep the weeds down. But so what do you use to keep the weeds down in between the plants, or what to get rid of the weeds?
So the idea is that if you have a healthy soil, weeds aren't as tempted to grow there. So we work on getting the health of the soil up and also using a mulch. So usually like a brush mulch. This is a good example. This is a recycled product. If you're up in the city of Oceanside, you are very lucky because you have a wonderful resource at the El Corazon facility. Agri-Service takes in the yard waste, and City of Oceanside residents get access to compost or composted mulch for free. So wonderful resource. If you live in the city of San Diego, the Miramar Greenery does something similar. They take in the landscape recycling. They don't give you as nice a quality of mulch. So what you get back is really the same stuff that your neighbors have put in their greenways. They chop it up and they give it back to you. And so that includes if someone's thrown a can in there, or they've included rose thorny plants or palms, everything gets chopped up and that's in the free pile. Mm-hmm. So for Miramar, you might want to look at some of the small, minor purchase price for some of their higher quality mulches. Okay. But that's what we use to keep weeds down.
Okay, can you tell me the difference between the composted mulch and the brush mulch?
Yes, so the compost has gone through a heating process. So they pre-sort the clippings, and it's a blend. It's a blend of the woody material, the leaves, the grass blades, twigs, and they put them in big piles, and they monitor the internal temperature of those piles and fluff them every so often. And what that does is it kills any weed seeds or pathogens that might be in the donated, landscape materials. Mm-hmm. And they will then screen it, and they'll screen it to compost, which is very, very fine. I don't know if you can see that. Okay. Or kind of the larger pieces, which is the mulch. So compost goes in the soil as an amendment. Compost mulch goes on soil, so it kind of blocks out that weed layer. And so anything that's been composted has gone through that process. It takes about 60 days to produce that. A regular brush mulch has not gone through that process. It's the same input material. It just hasn't been allowed to get the internal temperature and kill all the pathogens and weed seeds. A similar starting product.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I do not see any other raised hands. So if you do have a question, raise your hand now and I can let you ask. Oh, we did have one come in via email. So regarding the weed barrier fabric, what would you recommend when using rock or DG in a project? Do those need any barrier?
So with rock, I would recommend a filtered fabric kind of weed barrier. And that is, again, to protect your investment of rock and keep it from settling down into the soil. For decomposed granite, you don't have to put a weed barrier in, because when you're installing, if you're using decomposed granite for like a walkway, you don't generally have a weed fabric because you're installing it over a base material. So usually you dig down about 4 to 6 inches and put a solid base, and then you put the 3 inches of decomposed granite over it like paving, and that might be stabilized. So that has a thing that binds it together and you wet it down and it becomes a bit like concrete, or it could be unstabilized where it's still real dusty. For residential projects, I've found that a lot of people aren't happy with decomposed granite because it has a very fine dust that's easily tracked inside. So for residential, a lot of people move towards a small gravel, like a broken up 3/8 of an inch rock. And that keeps tracking dust inside the house, from happening. We use decomposed granite a lot in parks and public open spaces because when it's stabilized, it can actually be a wheelchair accessible surface. So you see it used in public landscapes a lot because it meets our American Disabilities Act criteria.
Great, thank you. And Tanya, you're up.
Okay, so another comment question that I didn't get answered, and you may skipped over, I'm not sure, was about a weed killer. Now, is there a weed killer, a specific product that we are allowed or supposed to use, or is that totally, oh, I'm unstable.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit off topic. Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit. So it's a little bit off topic, like that's really part of our installation and maintenance and not so much design. I will just say that there's inorganic and organic choices for herbicides. My personal opinion is if you're using either variety, you need to be following the manufacturer's instructions and making sure you have protective gear on it. You know, like gloves, and you know, you might have a face mask and things like that. Installing or spraying them within the right temperature range. Most of the problems that occur with misuse by actually residential people, because people at the professional level are highly regulated and trained to properly apply herbicides and pesticides. Pesticides is a different matter. When you get into killing another living creature, you have to use a lot more poison and much more toxic concoction. So generally, it's pretty easy to kill plants. We generally do that with salt. Most of our inorganic killers are based on glyphosate, which is a type of salt. There's problems with how it sticks to the plants, but I would say the overall toxicity is pretty low. And I would say, you know, do your research and make sure you're applying according to the ratios and the manufacturer's recommendations and protecting yourself no matter what you choose.
Thank you.
Great, and I also wanted to bring up that Moody's Alcor Zone Reclamation Facility does provide Oceanside residents free rock, so you can go and get rock and gravel from them as well.
Wow, you guys are all taken care of up there. Nice. Thanks for sharing that. I had no idea. Okay, functional design. That was like a little stormwater detour. Sorry. So form follows function, and I teach my students at Southwestern College that they can create the most beautiful landscape with the most beautiful stone, but if it doesn't function to support what their client needs to do in their yard, it's not going to be a successful design. So it's important to think about this new space you have. How are you going to use the space? What kind of activities are going to occur there? Are they active uses like cooking and eating and entertaining, sports, play, you know, small kids playing, pets running around, food production? Is there a pool? Or are there passive uses? Is it resting and meditative and viewing? Does your current layout work? You know, if you're looking at converting turf, does the perimeter of the turf work? Or do you need to kind of erase some of the edge lines and spill into adjacent planter areas to make a new space work? So generally those little dividers are mow curbs or little edging, and those are pretty easy and inexpensive to remove. So don't feel constrained just by this little island of turf. Start thinking about your area as a whole area. So plan the entire space. So think about how a space could be used, not how it's currently used. Going back to, is it an outdoor room, a view garden, or a pathway? Do you want to add seating areas, maybe pathways meandering through planting islands if it's a garden so you can maintain it? And how are you going to move through your yard? You know, how are you going to get the trash cans that are on the side? Is there a pathway that's needed for those? So think about the functionality. So, you know, we start this process with creating a functional bubble diagram. Here's an example of one of our participants, pretty standard big chunk of lawn, one little planter in the middle of it. And this is what they created. So still a little bit of a view garden. There's a little bench in there. They've certainly got the rocks so that they're limiting water use with that turf, but then a nice edging of kind of plants around the edge and a nicer walkway probably going up to the front door over here. Yes, looks like driveway and then a nice walkway to the front. This got a little bit of all three elements in this design. It's a pretty significant sized piece of turf. Again, I really like, this is one of our past participants in the 4-class series, and they've got the very traditional, you know, developer front yard where it's got this little narrow walkway to the door. They've got this slope in front that's all turf because it is cheapest for a developer to throw down turf. It's not cheapest for you to maintain that turf because there's a lot of water use that goes with it, but it's not especially usable turf because you've got this slope around the edges. So there's a little flat part right here, but a lot of slope. And so what they turned it into is they had a kind of, we're on a cul-de-sac where they all like to kind of have these block parties. And so they created this outdoor room in front where they could sit out with their neighbors and put tables up. And then they really kind of pushed that out a little bit and made the slope a little bit steeper, and then wrapped it with these beautiful plants. So they gave themselves a view garden and an outdoor room in that design. Here's some good examples of almost what we call our billboard effect, when we start to put massings of plants, not just 1 and 2 plants together, and creating these big drifts of plants. We create something that's a little bit more eye-catching. Because if you think about curb appeal, people are driving past the house at, you know, 20 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour. And so when you have these big groups of planting, it catches their attention more and makes that property stand out a little bit. So maybe you have a house that you're thinking about renovating to sell, and you don't really need any entertainment areas in front. You might think about this kind of drifts of plant to create that interest in a view garden setting. So wayfinding, we touched on this earlier, but this is giving some visual cues to where a visitor is supposed to go when they access the house. And I understand this is a complex up in Carlsbad, and all the houses are like that. And you can see as you approach this house, if you've never been there before, it's not really clear how you get to the front door. Both sides are pretty overgrown, and I think about 50% of people, when I ask if they think it's right or left, it's pretty split down the middle. So we can improve this situation by providing definite cues in the landscape to direct people which way to go. And we can do that, in this case, they're reducing the turf, creating a wide walkway, bringing people around to that side of the house where the entry is, creating, you know, this one has some little benches and pottery, so really not having anything overgrown, and the wide pathway that has a little nicer paving is all providing an indication which direction you go. And if you had any doubts, you could add a sign that says entrance on it. Another design solution at the big picture is we can do a lot of climate mitigation and keeping the inside of our house cooler with a big tree. Deciduous trees work really well for this because they shade the house in summertime, and then in wintertime they lose their leaves so that the sun can get to the house and warm it up. I would say this is a nice solution for, you know, climate, but not if you live in a high fire hazard area. We would want that tree further away from the house to keep a different, not create a ladder fuel to burn the house. If you're on the edge of a canyon, probably not the best solution. But if you're kind of in a, very low fire risk urbanized area, you might think about adding a big tree strategically placed to help with some of the climate control of the house. How about security? You've got some plants that are clearly spiny, thorny. It's a visual deterrent. And a lot of the succulents have that as an adaptation strategy to avoid being eaten in very arid climates. But there's also a lot of plants like this natal plum that looks very green and tropical. It's got these little white flowers that turn into red fruits that are actually edible. But there's big spines in that plant, so they will also be a deterrent. So maybe if you're on a busy corner and there's been burglaries in your neighborhood, you might want to think about thorny plants in strategic areas, like by windows that are accessible to the front, to help deter people from messing with your house. Or as my colleague said, if you have 13-year-old teenage daughters, this can also be an effective deterrent for them to leave the house in the middle of the night. Screening. A lot of times we talked about good views if you're fortunate enough to live like our clients on the edge of Point Loma, where you look over to the bay and the military base. But sometimes we have screening that is like the neighbor's trash cans or ugly, RV that is parked and you have to walk out your door every day and look at it. So simply by creating a row of shrubs that are appropriately sized, we can kind of create the edge of our property and not have to look at something that maybe we might not appreciate seeing every day. So these are some, pretty nicely, this is actually a pretty small, this Podocarpus macrophyllus maci or shrubby yew. This one is about 3 to 4 feet wide at maturity and gets about 12 feet high. It's a moderate grower, but a really nice small scale screening shrub for residential projects. This one's a bit bigger. I like the laciness of this particular one. This is the Pittosporum silversheen. It gets a bit wider. It might be 5 or 6 feet wide, and it might get 15 to 20 feet tall, but is really kind of an interesting screening edge if you have the room for it. So we start when we start taking a pencil to paper, we really look at doing this path that's called a functional design. And this is really low, we have our base plan with the grid paper. We might lay a piece of tracing paper over it. And this is very simple and free kind of bubble diagramming, thinking about, do I have an outdoor room? Do I have a view garden? You can see from this one, there's a little outdoor room and you've got part view garden. So closest to the street in the public area, you've got low, medium, and tall plants creating a view garden. And then as you come up the door, there's a little protected space that's functioning like an outdoor room. And you can see in this design that they need to have access. Maybe, there's the meter equipment is over here, or over here is your trash. So they want access to both sides of their house. And in this case, there's some screening shrubs along the perimeter. So it's really kind of creating that master plan for your new landscape space. Here's an example of stormwater being integrated into a redesign of a turf area. So in this case, they only need access along the one side, and you've got your traditional walkway going up. They've got a little bit smaller of an outdoor room, and they've kind of are taking the water maybe at a gutter downspout and bringing it through kind of that dry creek bed effect and infiltrating it away from the house, away from the sidewalk, in an area in that kind of envelope where it's not going to do any damage. So nice effect with stormwater integrated in. This might be more of just a view garden. This is actually a good solution for those of you who maybe have the mailman who goes door to door and every day tromps through your yard and has created a cattle trail, or maybe you have visitors come and it's just easier for them to walk through your yard versus around. So this is kind of respecting that circulation pattern that people might take, and creating a couple different pathways. You might create some kind of an accent for interest along that way. That could be a small sculpture. Sometimes it's just a beautiful pot filled with flowers that are draping over. If you're traveling, maybe you see some kind of interesting yard art. Just some little interest along the way, you know, taking you up to the landing, and then just some planted areas to kind of fill in the space. Still screening over here. Again, in this case, they're only accessing the side of the house on the one side. And this would be your view garden. So again, access to the house on one side. They have their screening shrubs here. And now they've got these little islands of planting so they can kind of circulate through here. In this case, they've added an accent in the center just so that there's some interest as you kind of meander through this landscape. Again, all good solutions to replace like that front turf area. So you want to create first your overall bubble diagram, and then you would focus on these areas that are identified as planting areas and start dividing them up. So this is our case study house. We've got our public sidewalk. We've got our two small planting areas. We've got our little landing and our walkway to the front door. And then you'll remember that we had this staggered effect of the plants going from highest to lowest. So our tall plants in this design are kind of back against the wall. Medium-sized plants are in the middle, and then low plants are along the walkway. And when you put low plants along the walkway, it provides a more kind of a restful feeling. If you think about you're walking up and you've got bags of things you're carrying into the house, you're not running into plants. It feels a little bit calmer and more serene on that entry to have a little bit more visual width, even if you're not changing the size, of the paving, like along the sidewalk. So, most of the times we recommend low plants along walkways. So then we can start adding forms. So we've got our bubble diagram kind of fleshed out, and we can start sketching out what maybe the hardscape and amenities configuration looks like. So we can include walkways and driveways, walls, patios, fences, walls, any elements like fountains or pots or arbors or rocks. That's where we'd start including that. So the process is we're starting with that bubble diagram, kind of refining the bubble diagram, and then moving into actual forms. So you started with that base sheet on grid paper, and you can just keep laying pieces of tissue paper over the top to continue to refine and get to that plan level, what you're actually going to install. So we're thinking about, three-dimensional with landscape. So you can see here you've got tall plants along the back, and you've got some medium plants in the middle, and then low-growing accent plants along the front. So there's this layered effect. Here they've done that layering by including stone walls and creating this arbor. So there's a definite entry point, and you're transitioning to this other space. So sometimes those can be nice to add in. And this is kind of that layered effect, tall, medium, and low. Pretty traditional layering. Can be formal where we start to shear it, or it can be left very natural. And if you have islands, it's really the same concept. We're just grouping our tall plants in the middle, and then grouping the medium and the low plants along the edges. So always thinking about that layering of plants. So we can start to transition from our bubble diagram and adding forms to our idea. And we look at forms in relationship to geometric forms or natural forms. And forms are good because they provide visual order and edges between spaces. So if this is my bubble diagram for my yard, and I want a rectangular form, and those are pretty easy to use, related to a lot of our materials are very rectangular. If you think about bricks or wood, a lot of times the way we pour concrete, it's a simpler form of labor sometimes in a rectangular or square type of form. So the way we might transition from this bubble diagram to something like this is we might create a grid in the backdrop of our sketch, and we can start to just clip out pieces. Like if this is like an outdoor room, and then we've got a little pathway connector to each one of these, we can just start pulling out pieces out of that grid to create these forms. For angular and hexagonal forms, they're a little bit less formal than rectangular forms. Certainly geometric, though. Those can create some interest in the landscape. Here's same idea with my bubble diagram, and now I could use a grid that's on a 45-degree and a 90-degree to start getting some of these angles around my bubble and start creating some interesting forms. So here's a little hexagonal space, a little less rigid than if this was a rectangle. This was kind of an interesting project we worked on that was kind of a new style craftsman house, and it had some very interesting angles off of that. So we were able to pull some of those angles driven by the architecture into the landscape and help unite that landscape with the house. Circles are a common form that you see in the landscape. And so circles create this sense of unity and wholeness. It tends to be a little bit calmer feeling of a design. This is what we would call a radial circular design. So here's our bubble diagram, and you'd almost create this spider web type grid and then clip out pieces, and you end up with a form like this. And this is just more of a pure circular design with the edges filled with plants. When we look at naturalistic forms, the most common one is the organic meander. And so this is kind of smooth back and forth transitions that are inspired by nature. Many times we see this used for walkways or dry stream beds. So good examples of like that stormwater dry creek, you know, this is the type of form we might consider this very naturalistic form. Also for walkways. So this is a very different feel than some of those more geometric forms. Has a little more natural, it's a little bit more relaxing than when you have a rigid geometry like a circle in your landscape. And so now we move into the aesthetics portion. So this part is the fun part for me. This provides our interest and our impact to the landscape, creates those focal points and kind of catches the eye. And we can work on integrating these by contrasting plant textures and values and colors. And so our doctor always tells us to eat oatmeal because it's very good for us. And it's kind of boring. If you were to eat oatmeal every day, you'd be like, oh, again, I have to start my day with this. But when you start adding, you know, some spices and some fruits and some nuts, suddenly oatmeal becomes a much more different experience. So the idea of the aesthetics portion is really like oatmeal filled with our fun parts. This is where we dial down and start picking the pretty colored plants and features of our landscape, the detail of our landscape. So first we want to think about proportion and the relative size of objects within our landscape design. So you see these Italian cypresses being used a lot in our landscape, and the traditional one gets about 80 feet tall really quickly. And most of them are out of proportion to the scale of our residential houses. So it can actually make a house appear a lot smaller when you see these type of large trees planted so close to the house, you know, in addition to creating maintenance problems and having to keep it out of the roof. So there are smaller versions of this. So if you like this look of the Italian cypresses, there are varieties that are maybe, you know, 15 to 20 feet tall. So if a residential house is 10 feet, 15 to 20 feet is going to be up in here. And that's more appropriate scale for a residential lot, generally, unless you have a big estate in Rancho Santa Fe. So here's an example of those smaller ones, so it's starting to really kind of complement the architecture and, kind of be that formal, classical, you can see the sheared shrubs and the upright cypress trees, that's kind of reflecting the architecture style too. Think about unity. So, what that means is if your existing turf area was right here, you might not just want to improve just that particular area, but you might want to also carry some of those plants or like these rocks throughout the landscape to kind of unite all the areas that are in the same view. And so repeating plant selections and materials through the landscape creates this sense of unity. Color is a lot of fun to work with. And it's a really powerful component of our aesthetics. So most of us grew up talking about primary colors and focused mainly on these back in the day. But there's also another set of primary colors, or we'll say these are primary colors and they're triadic colors. So it's a united color family. There's also another set of triadic colors in the purple, orange, and green that are a little bit more popular in landscape today. And then you have complementary colors. So when colors exist across from one another, across the color wheel, that would be complementary. A great example of that would be our Christmas colors, red and green. So when we place those next to each other, it's a very vibrant effect. It's very attention-getting. Versus if we have analogous colors, colors that are placed alongside one another on the color wheel, that creates a little bit more of a toned down look to our landscape. So maybe you like a very soothing landscape, you might pick colors that are in the blues and purples and have it just be one kind of color scheme versus either three colors or two complementary colors. So we can kind of harmonize our color into soothing or energizing. When we get into the greens and the blues and the burgundies and the purples, it tends to be a soothing landscape. When we get into the yellows and the reds and the oranges, that tends to be an energizing landscape. Or you can be kind of in the middle where there's a little bit of like the orange and the purple. This is really kind of that triadic, right? With the just off orange yellow and then this kind of light lavender and then the green of the foliage. It's kind of something in the middle. So think about using color to support the mood that you want in your landscape. And again, for a calm environment, maybe you work in a very stressful work situation and you just want a very serene environment, you might stay towards those soothing colors. Excuse me. If you're the one who likes to throw parties, maybe you want to move towards these energizing colors. And then looking at the lines of the design. So this is a very naturalistic line, kind of like that organic meander form. This has a more relaxed, informal feel, versus this is a very geometric, formal, classic design. My guess is if you were going to take a blanket and spread it out in one of these landscapes, you probably would feel more inclined to do that on a grassy area of this design that's more informal versus this one. This one, it feels like you're right in the pathway to somebody's house because you are. And you'll notice at Balboa Park that we handle a lot of people in a small space. It tends to have a very formal, classical feel, and that is kind of to control the movement of people. I would say at the heart of the park in the formal gardens, but then you have outlying grassy areas where it certainly is appropriate to pull up a blanket. So the forms and the type of lines you use in your design are going to give cues to people on how you want them to use your landscape. If you don't happen to live on Point Loma and have this spectacular view, no worries. You can set a view by using a focal point. So in these instances, we're creating views. In this case, this was kind of at the center of a big entry of a house in this nice little cluster of bubbling urns. These are water features, but they go into what's called a pondless basin, so it's all recirculated. And they're pretty water efficient because they're not evaporating a lot of water. So if you want water feature in your yard, think about something like that. This is a really nice kind of using almost architectural salvage to create a view. And you can see the edge of a basin here. And the only thing that I would have liked to have seen with this design is a pathway, because now I have this great little view with all the flowers and the birdhouse, but I want to go sit on that little blue bench. And so if you create a view like this, maybe from something inside your house, you might also think about a pathway so that people who use the yard can actually get to it too. But I think a nice little composition and something that would have just been kind of a boring corner of the property. Varying our texture and our contrast are also ways to add interest to the landscape. So here you see this very coarse broadleaf agave next to this very, very fine Mexican feathergrass. And that's creating a lot of contrast between those different textures. So plants come in a range of textures, their leaf sizes. So you know, if you're mixing, maybe you don't like a lot of color in your landscape, you'd like a lot of green. The way we would keep that interesting is we would vary the leaf sizes of the different plants that we would use in there to create this contrast in texture. And then you can also create, you know, kind of a color contrast. What I like about this cluster of 3 different agaves, even though they're very different species, is they all pick up on colors from one another. So you've got this blue-gray agave Americana in the back, but this agave has a little bit of that blue-gray, so it starts to relate to that one. And this also has these yellow margins. It's a variegated variety. And then you have this very yellow agave. So it's starting to relate to this, and now you've got this little unified family of 3 different agaves that are contrasting, but also still working together. And then one of the biggest design challenges is our parkways and medians. So, you know, looking to some of the commercial solutions, our median solutions can help you with that, because those generally have to handle maybe low plants that don't impair visibility. So they're mostly low with trees, and also some maintenance access or thoroughfare access for the people who have to work on them. So you can see that there's, you know, a nice repetition here of a cluster of plants, some edges where people could get out of their cars and cut through and walk to an entry of a house. And there's this repetition of, you know, low plants and then rocky border plants and trees scattered. Same here. So think low growing. They can be very linear in form, but they should be able to handle some amount of people walking through them. Hopefully things that aren't too pokey so that kids don't get injured walking on their way to school. And then maybe the occasional tree in there if you don't already have them. Here's some that starts to get some more curvilinear lines. Always a challenge in these little, you know, parkways, sometimes called hell strips. So some interesting little pebbles inset into the concrete to create some interest, in these waves of grasses and low-growing flowering shrubs, creating some interest in there. And then naturalistic. So this is kind of a native meadow wildflower effect, just seated in there. Here's just using some gravel and some big rocks and a few specimen plants. So some good solutions for that challenging space. And in these kind of naturalistic garden, I think the key to it is understanding that although the design appears random, there's often a repetition of plants throughout it to kind of keep it looking unified. So that is important. You know, as designers, we're trying to kind of have the eye connect different pieces of the landscape together to create that unified whole. And these can also function to channel stormwater. So there's some nice, you know, here's a little rocky creek bed. So the paving could drain into there and manage the water. Here's actually a deeper swale where water is filling up in a rain event, but you could do that in your parkway in front also. This one's more of a hidden. The water's shedding into there, but the surface looks flat, but it's excavated down below to handle that water instead of seeing a surface kind of basin or ditch there. Non-planted ideas for medians could be interlocking pavers. Those come both in permeable and non-permeable options. This is showing permeable, and the way you can tell the difference is the permeable have bigger joints. They're usually less than ½ inch wide, and they'll have little rocks in there. So water runs across it and gets pulled down into the underlying base, which is has been over excavated, and there's layers of rock underneath it that infiltrate water slowly. And this is a nice reuse of recycled concrete. So if you're tearing out an old patio, you could think about, you know, kind of having the contractor jackhammer this up into usable sizes and creating paving, or even in this case, there's poking some up to create this edge with a little bit of planting back there. Decomposed granite and cobble can get used there, or anywhere in the landscape, a nice effect. And so when we move into implementation, the basic process is demolition, contouring, so shaping mounds and infiltration basins if you choose to add those, amending our soil, irrigation, adjusting our irrigation or adding new irrigation, placing our plants, installing our plants, maintaining them, and then 2 years later, hopefully we have that established landscape. So for our implementation resources, you can do it yourself. There's some really, really wonderful videos. YouTube has gotten so good. It's almost anything you want to learn how to do, you can find some really good resources to support trying to figure this all out yourself on how to install, or look towards professional services. So what's right for you? And that's really a trade-off of cost versus your labor and time. There's kind of an option to be the general contractor yourself, which means that you're hiring the guy who just installs the plants and the irrigation, and hiring the guy who just does the hardscape. So, you know, organizing different trades to come in and help you. For design, you can get some support from the American Society of Landscape Architects, ASLA. There is a consumer resources page on our San Diego chapter website that lists landscape architects who do work on residential projects. I would say landscape architects, we are trained in a lot of ways like civil engineers, with understanding grading and drainage and retaining walls and things like that, and moving through a city permit process. So generally, we get involved in larger projects that need to go through some kind of permitting. So if you're just taking out turf and renovating, it might be overkill to work with a landscape architect, maybe not. There's also the Association of Professional Landscape Designers, or APLD. They have a San Diego chapter, and they keep a residential list. Landscape designers is a loose term in California. It is a unlicensed profession. So they are allowed to work doing conceptual design for single family residential, but there's no professional licensure process like a landscape architect would have. And anybody can call themselves a landscape designer. So there's very, very good landscape designers, and there's some who just really have not had training. And so it's more important to interview people, ask for recommendations, look at their portfolio work to understand if they have the qualifications that are needed to get you through a successful design. If you just need help with irrigation design, you can look for a certified irrigation designer. And if you go on to the irrigation.org website, that's a great organization that also keeps a list of locally practicing people that specialize in irrigation design. For implementation or repair, and I know this question came up earlier, the California Landscape Contractors Association has a San Diego chapter, and they have a find a contractor near you section and list, again, contractors who work residential work. So that's a great starting point to look for a contractor. Same with the Irrigation Association or irrigation.org. They also have people who install irrigation. So you can research people who work residential scale on their website. And there's a lot of YouTube videos too that can help you if you're a do-it-yourselfer, understand how some of these systems go together. Home Depot sometimes offers the weekend classes that have some nice topics. If you're hiring a licensed professional, you always want to check a license. So you can go on to our state's Contractors License Board, and there's a very easy way to type in either their name or their license number and check the status of your license. Know that any licensed contractor should be listing their license number on any business card they give you, any proposal they give you. They're required to list it. So it should be readily available to you. If you don't see a number listed, then that's an indication that they may not be a licensed contractor. Same with landscape architects. We have a licensure board. We are not required to list our license on everything we produce. So you can go on and just type in somebody's name and see if there's been complaints filed against them. But there is a state agency that regulates us along with contractors. So for our program, you can visit our site for things like applying for our Water Smart Landscape Makeover Series, viewing today's presentations or slides, watching on-demand videos, accessing additional education resources. We talked a little bit about the SLP, Sustainable Landscape Guide is called SLP, and that has a lot of those calculations for stormwater if you were really excited about stormwater. And then there's other special topic workshops. Again, we're getting up to speed on hosting these webinars. So there's a few maybe on there now, but you'll be seeing in the next month more of them popping up on that location. And here's an example of the website. So again, this is where you would apply for the 4-class series. This is what you guys have attended today. So if you wanted to print out a PDF of this presentation, you could do that here. Here's the videos on demand, and then events and resources. That would be where you go on to find this homeowner's guide to a water smart landscape. That's the founding piece of this whole program, or the Sustainable Landscape Guide. And then SoCalWatersmart.com or BeWatersmart.com. There's a couple portals that will take you to this. This is the turf rebate site. And so know that there's turf removal rebates, but there's also a bunch of other rebates related to those rotating sprinkler nozzles, weather-based irrigation system controllers. I believe rain barrels are still on there. Soil moisture sensor systems, which is a whole nother animal. I would also go on to your agency website, whoever you pay your water bill to, because sometimes they have specific agency rebates. So take a look at that. And again, in order to qualify for a turf rebate, it's important to not remove your turf until you receive a notice to proceed. And then if you've created a wonderful, beautiful landscape, there is the landscapecontest.com. A number of the member agencies in San Diego use this to award stunning landscapes in their area. Entering is free, and there is cash prizes available. So if you feel like you've done a really good job, then certainly get recognized for your efforts. Right. We've got plenty of time to take questions. I guess I raced through that.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. All right, we have Melinda. I'm going to unmute now.
Yeah, hi. I just a logistical thing I wanted. A link you sent, it bounces back. I don't know if it may be misspelled or something. But
so, you broke.
I'm sorry?
You broke up. So when you were talking, we lost your signal, so we didn't hear what you said.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay. The first thing I want to say, just logistical thing, the email link that you said for sending in questions, that link doesn't work. The email bounced back, so the address may be misspelled or something.
Oh, no. So we did send you an email with the link to that email so that you could click on it and it
Yeah,
would...
I know. That's what I did. It may bounce back. But my question, basically a two-part question. One, can you recommend a good computer program, some good software for actually putting together landscape design plans?
That's a tricky one. As a landscape architect, we use these really complex engineering programs. It's by Autodesk, called Autodesk AutoCAD. And that's pretty much our industry standard. I know a lot of the landscape contractors use a program called Pro Landscape. I'm not that familiar with it, but I know they like that one a lot. I am not really that well versed in the different things that might be more homeowner level type programs like that. But I know there's some out there where you can input a picture of your yard and it kind of starts with that and add plants to it. So I don't know, that might be a good Google question.
Okay. So the other part was, I think you mentioned El Corazon, and I was just, I Googled it to try to get some information. I don't, do they have their own website where I can get the information?
Yeah, so there's El Corazon is the facility name, but the company that runs the recycling program is called AgriService. And I would say AgriService Landscape Mulch, because there's a lot of AgriServices across the country for farming. So, or maybe AgriServices Oceanside might be a good keyword to get you to the company's website. But that'll list all their products, and it's a nice, robust website. That should help you.
Okay.
There's also Moody's, which is the other, the operator El Corazon that gives out the rock and those materials. Okay. So I can also send out the links to the...
Yeah, that would be very useful if you send out any links you may have on the El Corazon.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Tanya, you are up.
Okay, I had a question about how long does this process take from beginning to end if you're doing it by yourself? Do you have a kind of a general idea, or does that really depend?
I think it depends on the scope of what you're trying to do. I would say if you're planning to just remove your turf, and replace it with plants and, adjust your existing irrigation system, I would plan for at least 6 weeks. If you're getting into hardscape and other amenities, then you're probably more in, 2.5 months, I think is a realistic. It's going to kind of go in phases. But I think it depends on the scope of what you're doing.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, and we have an email question. So this person has Mexican feathergrass, but is told that it is now considered an invasive species in SoCal. He's wondering, how much do I need to consider invasiveness in my plant material choices?
That is a really good question. So when we look to Mediterranean climate to reduce our water use, sometimes we're using plants that don't have natural predators and do too well in our climate, and they reseed readily with little help and little protection from diseases or pests that would normally keep them in check. Mexican feathergrass is from across the border. It's native to Baja. It does reseed readily in the landscape. So if you go through, like, Solana Beach Rail Trail has tons and tons and tons of Mexican feathergrass, and if you were to go along there, you would see the little seedlings popping up in, like, the cracks of the sidewalk. So there's certainly an invasiveness maintenance factor that you might have to be removing, new seedlings. If you were on the edge of a naturalized open space system, then you wouldn't really want those seedlings to spill down and start to overtake the native environment. So being conscious of invasive plants is a great thing. There's a website called the California Invasive Plant Council, or cal-ipc, calepc.com, and they keep a list of all the plants in California that are invasive. Now, it's a pretty big list. A lot of them are like European grasses, like for cattle, but there are a number, there's probably, if I had to guess, maybe 200 horticultural species out of the probably 5,000 or 6,000 that grow in our area. So it's always nice to keep an eye on that, especially if you're on the edge of a native environment, a naturalized wildland system, to not plant an invasive pest on the edge of something like that. Otherwise, it becomes just maybe a little bit more maintenance for you to remove the seedlings as they pop up in your yard.
Great. We don't have any more hands raised. Let's see, there's one more question that came in. Will all plants, including native drought-resistant plants, need some sort of irrigation, or can you go without?
Yeah, good question. So when we get into the very low water use plants, those generally are our native plants that have well-established drought adaptation. The most common one in our region is going what's called summer deciduous, which means in August it looks like brown crispy sticks. So those types of plants wouldn't need supplemental water, and in fact you shouldn't water them supplementally, because they tend to die out quickly if you do. They're adapted to no water for 8 months. So if you can live with that look in your landscape, that isn't, that's not a problem. What I find is that a lot of people will plant those, not realize they plant those, they turn into brown crispy sticks, and then they say, oh, I hate native plants, they're so ugly. Know that there's some really great native plant choices that are very low water, that maybe you only have to water not at all in winter, maybe once a month in spring, and maybe once or twice a week in the heat of summer, that are what we call like garden friendly California natives. So that means really that they can handle some some summer water. On that resources page, we have some plant palettes, and we have our garden-friendly California native plant palettes. So you might want to take a look at that. Actually, it's in the book, it's in the new homeowner's guide too. We've added those palettes in there. So that'll kind of like get you a running start. There's some really great native plant nurseries. I know used to be called Recon Native Plants. They've recently changed their name to Native West Nursery in South Bay, in the kind of, I guess it's more the Imperial Beach area. And in North County, you have Moosa Creek Nursery, and there's another one out in Fallbrook, Las Politas Nursery. So if you're into native plants, look at some of their websites because they have some really great information posted. And I know Native West Nursery has, in normal times anyway, they have weekend plant sales to residents. So they're a wholesale nursery, but they will have maybe 6 native plant sales a year during good times to plant natives.
Great, thank you. I'm going to unmute Malind.
Yeah, hi. Just following up on this question of really low water use plants. I guess I think I know the answer, but I just wanted to confirm. So in all these, we're not talking about anything that would let you just get rid of your irrigation system. Is there?
I've seen people do that. Like I have one of our past participants planted California natives, and what they would do is they kept buckets in their shower, so their warm-up water, they would fill up, if it was warming up, they would fill up buckets, and then they would bring them out and empty that onto the plants in their front for their native plants. I think if you're okay with brown crispy sticks, or sometimes you can get away with, if you have the right percolation, like the Arizona succulents, you don't necessarily need an irrigation system. If you're not happy with brown crispy sticks as plants, you're probably going to need to add some level of supplemental water to keep it looking good. So if you live in an HOA and they're going to drive around and they pull up to your yard and everything looks like it's dead and crispy, you might be battling with them to say, but it's native plants and they're alive and they'll come back in the spring, and they're going to say, but that's an eyesore and you can't have that in the front yard. So, you know, I think it's just depending on where you're located is probably going to, like, what look are you acceptable and is acceptable to you, and what look is acceptable to your community you live in. You know, in some of the older areas, you can make that choice. There's no one to regulate that. But know that generally, if you're 0, water, you might not have a very attractive landscape for certain parts of the year.
So even with things like succulents and like cactus type plants, that they still need irrigation?
So if you have that well-draining soil, you know, you have that sandy kind of soil and you've got a good percolate, water is draining fast, you can look to some of those Arizona succulents that probably would adapt with no water and do just fine. It really comes down to your soil percolation and texture, whether you can successfully grow those super arid climate succulents. And that if that's compatible, you should be able to plant those in and get them established. We still add supplemental irrigation for through the first 2 rainy seasons, and then after that, they should be able to go irrigation free beyond that. But you've got to have those other components working for you to get those successfully established. Or import soil. We talked about importing soil too. So you could also create, if you didn't have a good infiltration rate of the soil or sandy soil, you could build mounds of a sandy soil and get those plants established also.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. And Tanya, go ahead.
Okay. This may be irrelevant, I'm not sure, but it pertains to me. We live on a canyon. We also have dogs, you know, so we don't want things that are hazardous to the animals if they eat it. And then I've also had problems with bunnies in the past eating whatever I've planted. How do you go about that, figuring that out?
Yeah, so a couple of different tips on that one. There is a plant list by ASCPA. It's one of the humane societies that lists plants that are toxic to dogs. There's also a plant list from the California Poison Control Center that are toxic to humans if you guys have little ones. So those are great lists to go through. It's always interesting to me you know, there's plants that I just have in my mind that are poisonous, and you go on there and they're not, but then ones that I forget are poisonous. So if you're designing with, you know, animals or young children, there is some great online help to help you sort through those. Rabbits are really difficult because rabbits pretty much eat everything if they're hungry enough. In general, we point people to a lot of our native plants have a lot of oils and don't taste very good, so they don't like the taste of them. Also, plants like lavender and rosemary, you know, from those similar arid climates, those are almost defense mechanisms to keep animals from eating them, just like the spines on cactus are really, that's their defense mechanism to survive when they're the only thing that has any water around. I can say on the edge of open space, I'm already seeing this in my community, is the rabbit population is going way down because we now have a pretty established coyote population. So there is this cyclical event. We had a big drought for many, many years. The rabbit and rodent and gophers took off once water came again and plants grew and blossomed. And now I'm seeing the kind of predators, you know, suddenly have abundant food, so they're having more offspring, and they will eventually get the rabbit problem in check. But then you've got coyotes running around for a while. Then they, you know, when there's not enough to feed them, they get hungry and they start to migrate into our yards. So you'll see this kind of predator-prey cycle.
Right.
So if that makes you feel any better.
Yeah. So
rabbits
the
should be less.
The gophers are a huge problem in my yard.
Yeah.
Is there anything for those specifically? Is it like the prickly type stuff?
So we've had some of our past participants actually install a mesh underneath their landscape to keep the gophers from coming up and grabbing the plants. Mm-hmm. That's a really expensive addition to your planting areas. Again, those same plants that aren't attractive to rabbits generally aren't attractive to gophers either. Those are things that have those, that kind of just have a high oil or, you know, taste. Marigolds, lavender, some of the Asteraceae, the daisies, they just have a bad taste to them, and so they tend to leave them alone. The only way I ever solved my gopher problem when I lived on a canyon was I sold the house. But I wasn't willing to go in and kill them and like trap them, and you know, I tried all these crazy tips I got on the internet of like juicy fruit gum if you give it to them, you know. So I tried all those things, none of those worked. So I have not had much success in getting rid of gophers. My dad was down telling me that at our old house on a canyon as a child that had gophers, the way that it was all kept in check is the rattlesnakes would come up out of the canyon and eat the gophers, and it was all balanced. So I guess you could, you know, wait for the rattlesnakes to show up, but
the rattlesnakes
it's a difficult problem. Does help with the gophers apparently.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry I'm not more help with that one. That's a tough one.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, We don't have any other questions or hands raised. If you do think of something, we can take those, but I'll take a moment now to just thank you, Michelle, for being here and sharing your knowledge. And everybody who's participated, thank you for being here and participating. We really hope you enjoyed the workshop and learned a lot. We are planning more workshops, and those are released on our website, greenoceanside.org. So if you want more specific instruction on plant selection, irrigation, or maintenance and installation, those are the 3 upcoming topic-specific workshops that we'll be doing throughout the summer. So check those out. And then we are going to send a survey out right after this workshop. So if you could please fill that out, your feedback is very valuable as we continue hosting these. And as I mentioned, we will also follow up with an email with information about the turf rebate program and El Corazon and any other resources we can think of. But the resources Michelle talked about that are in the slides are also very valuable. So again, check out those, and the link to download the slides is in a previous email that was sent out. So thank you again. I don't see any, oh, we do have one more question. Maybe, oh, yes. Well, for those of you that can't stick around, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend, but we will take questions if you have them. So Elizabeth, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, thank you. I have a problem with, I was away for 3 months and the South African buttercups took over my front yard. I mean, it's just taking days. I basically have raked the soil bare. Any ideas?
So generally when we're trying to eradicate plants, I'd probably treat that like some of our warm season grasses like Bermuda can be very persistent like that. So what I might think about doing if you're open to an herbicide is actually watering them and get them growing pretty well and then hitting them with like a Roundup type herbicide. And then you kind of let them die back and then you water them again and see if any areas come back. And you usually have to do about 2 rounds of that. Again, always when using something off the shelf like that, it's really important to follow the manufacturer's instructions. There's been a lot of press about Roundup, particularly. I think some of it's not well researched. From my experience in doing restoration and working with that product in very critical habitats with endangered species, the biggest problems are mixing the ratios wrong or using Roundup around aquatic systems, because what makes the Roundup, which is a salt, it's called glyphosate, it's a type of salt, damaging to aquatic systems is there's a chemical used in there to stick it to the plant leaves. And so that disrupts aquatic systems. So when we did restoration in, those aquatic environments, we used a different specialty version of it that has a different type of sticker to it that doesn't disrupt those systems. So what I've seen at the stores as a homeowner going to buy, the Roundup doesn't add as much as some of the off brands do. The off brands have some chemicals in there that make the plants turn brown really fast. So it makes us as the consumer feel like it's working, but it's just adding a lot more chemicals than maybe the basic thing was. So, do your research carefully, use it wisely if you choose to use an inorganic type killer, but it might take something like that.
I have a neighbor who used to use chlorine. Is there any value of that?
That's a good question. I mean, I would be concerned with chlorine to kind of disrupt some of the soil biology and prevent any plants from growing there in the future. A lot of the inorganic methods are like using vinegars and solutions like that. There's some pretty good off-the-shelf organic weed killers that I hear work pretty well. So
Okay.
maybe start with
Start with that.
start with those and see if that has any effect. But
Okay.
it's like warm season grasses. When we get into those very adapted to our climate, sometimes those aren't enough to disrupt the growth process of that. But certainly try with your least offensive means, and then if you have to go to a herbicide, know that an herbicide is a lot safer than a pesticide. Pesticides really have some dangerous chemicals in there. So
All right.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you guys for holding in there with our technical challenges today. So now I know to make sure my power cord is actually turned on. So, sorry about losing power in the middle. So anyway, thanks you guys. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, Nikki. Well, I guess I will circle back with you probably later in the week. So look forward to hearing your